speak. So I hope I don't prove that axiom true. I'll put it that way. But thank you for hosting me today. As many might know, is International Women's Day. And we at the American Security Project are just delighted with the ladies who have kept our organization running. Our current chairperson is Governor Christine Todd Whitman from New Jersey. And our senior fellow for climate is Jessica Yarmo, who happens to be in the audience this evening. So I want to especially thank those two and thank all the women who have helped us and who help our country, of course. These are astounding times, as everybody recognizes here, with what's gone on the last 2+ weeks in Ukraine. We had a board meeting at ASP earlier this evening. 2 of our members were in Europe. You can imagine the tension that's there. Among the many sad things that this presents, it's kind of pushed the climate change topic a little bit off the table here. Nonetheless, we view climate change as a threat to our national security, and I'm going to get into that in some detail. I was at the World Affairs Council Albuquerque 4 years ago. I think it was February 2017. You may recall that was about a month after the inauguration. A lot of apprehension then about what was going to happen with climate change, and the incumbent administration took the tone that they were pretty much going to cleanse those 2 words out of their vocabulary. And they more or less successfully did that. But the comment I made, and Bob reminded me when I was out there, was that they can take those 2 words out, but climate change didn't stop. And the Department of Defense, which is our Department of Defense, is very good at planning, contingency planning, nonetheless has continued to contingency plan for climate change and the impact it's going to have on bases and stations. Let me talk for just a second about ASP. We were founded in 2005 by 4 senators, Kerry, Hagel, Hart, and Rudman, 2 Republican, 2 Democrat. Coming off the 2004 election, of course, then Senator Kerry was not particularly excited about the outcome of that election. But one of his big disappointments was then as well, and when he talked about climate change, he got painted as somewhat the left-wing liberal that he was, and his message could not get through that it's really going to hurt our security and be a threat. So his thought was, let me get a couple of Republicans, a couple of Democrats, get together, put together a nonprofit that has no political bent one way or the other. We'll staff, certainly the board, with a number of what we call flag officers, generals and admirals, recently retired, 3- and 4-star from all 4 services, and we'll let them be the mouthpiece to talk about climate change and its threat to stability and the threat to the country. Now, we have a number of other issues that we also cover. Nuclear proliferation is another big one, and you can see what's going on today with Putin and China, and of course the JCPOA. We were big into those issues. We were big into the New START issue as well. So we've been pretty busy. And of course, now our plate is becoming just incredibly more full than it has ever been. And I guess you could say it's a boom business for us, right? Which isn't necessarily a good thing. So let me talk about the national security threats posed by climate change. And I'm going to talk a little bit about domestically, then I'll go internationally, and then I'll close it out and open it up to questions. Even towards the tail end of the Trump administration, the DoD IG came out with a list of challenges confronting the military about climate change. And let me just list off a few: rising sea levels, extreme weather such as flooding, wildfires, hurricanes, melting Arctic, which is a huge one, that all required the Department of Defense to plan for these non-traditional threats. Now, at the American Security Project, we've discussed these the extreme heat, drought, wildfires, storms, sea levels. We've discussed them for years. I mean, literally since 2005. But let me proffer some examples of each one of those. And the heat one's a big one. I'm the former commanding general at Parris Island. They're in South Carolina. It gets very hot there. And the hotter it gets, the more flag conditions you have, the less training you can do. It impacts your readiness. And we always put, and I always put, the safety of troops at the top of our issues. A joint report from NBC News found that 1,766 cases of heat stroke or heat exhaustion among active duty members happened in 2008. Okay, remember that figure, 1,766. In 2018, that figure was 2,792. It's a 60% increase in a decade. And the Marine Corps had it worse. It almost doubled the number of heat strokes that they had. So that extreme heat was causing us huge problems and a huge expense, over $1 billion plus. In addition to that, now we talk drought and wildfires. I'm sure you've seen the news the last couple of days, and they're having wildfires in Florida in March, unbelievably. And of course, California's had its worst wildfire season ever, the last couple. But to give you an idea of how that has impacted the military, in 2016, a fire near Vandenberg Air Force Base in California covered 10,000 acres and forced the closure of the southern part of the base and delayed a satellite launch. And you think, well, wildfires aren't going to stop space launches. Well, they did at Vandenberg out in California. Flooding has always been a problem. And I mentioned Parris Island again. I'm going down there in 2 weeks to host a forum talking about sea level rise and flooding there. But Nebraska's Offutt Air Force Base in 2019 had a huge flood, shut down the base, cost $500 million in damage to Offutt Air Force Base. Now, we're all familiar with the storms and everybody's talking about them and what damage they caused. 2018 was a particularly bad year. Tyndall Air Force Base was really hit by Hurricane Michael, virtually wiped out the base, caused $3 to $4 billion worth of damage. A little bit to my surprise, they are rebuilding that base at substantial cost. And I kind of question that a little bit, given its location, because it's just going to happen again. That same year, Hurricane Florence hit Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, which is one of my old homes. And it came ashore as a Category 2 hurricane. You wouldn't think that would be a big deal. Well, between the wind and the flooding, it caused $4 billion worth of damage to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. And we had to stop deploying a couple of our battalions because they had to do catastrophic response. So again, it affected our readiness. The Air Force, as a result of what happened at Tyndall, had to delay deploying its combat aircraft. They had to delay work at 61 repair facilities, and then they had to cut flying hours. These are all incredibly impactful on our readiness. And I'll talk about the poster child for sea level rise and flooding in its Norfolk Naval Base. And you wouldn't think a naval base would worry about flooding. Well, one of the biggest problems they had at Norfolk was the piers. All the electricity, the cabling for electrical was underneath the piers. And now what's happened with the repeated flooding and sea level rise, it's shorted them out. So as a consequence, they've had to raise the level of all the piers. And to compound this problem, the sailors couldn't even get to the ships because the base was routinely flooding. Now, I guess if there's any good side to this is they're well aware of this problem, as is the entire Hampton Roads area, and they're working heavily on adaptation. But of course, the long-term solution to this is what we call mitigation. So let me expand my comments a little bit and talk about climate security abroad. As you know, we want a stable international relationship with everybody. That ain't happening given what's happening today. And we're trying to predict where and when destabilizing events will occur, and it's almost becoming impossible. However, we can look at some of those, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples that you might not have considered. And the first one's going to be South Asia. And it's, we, of course, given what's happened with China recently, and now, of course, China cozying up to Russia, we're very, very concerned about all that. But that region has such ethnic strife and religious conflict that's climate induced, that's even making these problems worse. And I'll give you an example. South Asia is home to the headwaters of 6 major Asian rivers: the Indus, Ganges, Brahmaputra, Irrawaddy, Salween, and Mekong. And these are all flooding on a fairly routine basis. The Himalayas are melting, and as a consequence, it's changing monsoon rainfall patterns, and of course, it's causing flooding, and people are moving. And then, of course, China has a fair proportion of those as well. China's control over the source of these rivers gives it a power and a means to extend its influence in the region that's unparalleled, really. And so the climate risks in South Asia are going to destabilize our allies over there, India in particular, and they might invite future Chinese intrusion. The second example I want to give you is Latin America. And some think, Latin America is not a threat. Well, it's very strategically important to us, and because of its proximity. And now, given our problems with Russia and relationships with Cuba and Venezuela, it's going to certainly create more problems than we also ever thought possible. There are immigration issues here in Central America. What's going to happen is climate change is causing crops to fail. It's causing places to get warmer. It's causing people to move. And of course, they're moving up to our borders and coming here. And it's destabilizing Latin America. And again, it's starting to invite China and Russia to help them. So these are all problems here that are caused by climate change. And, of course, long term, we know what's causing it. It's CO2 in the atmosphere. The Biden administration is pretty much totally reversed almost all the Trump policies in regards to climate change. The Trump administration tried its best to take most of those words out of all their documents, but the national security strategy, and they're going to come out with a new national security strategy here in the next couple of months, but it's been delayed because of Ukraine. We'll certainly talk climate change. And of course, you all know Gina McCarthy is now the czar for climate change here in the United States, and John Kerry is the czar internationally. So there's been a phenomenal now increased emphasis on climate change and the threats that it's causing to us and all over the world. Some would say, is this inevitable? And I totally believe that it's like a cruise liner that's going down and you try to turn and it takes a couple of miles for it to turn. Yes, we can stop it, but we've got a long ways to go to stop CO2, and it's problematic. As you know, the Trump administration pulled us out of the Paris Accords. Fortunately, now the Biden administration's put us back into it. They just had COP26, and then now they're going to come up on COP27, I believe, in Egypt. It's Conference of Parties, which is one of the funding mechanisms for climate change, which John Kerry obviously represents us at. Both of those are welcome, but people have not risen to their requirements under the decisions made both on in COP26. Certainly, Congress and DoD have to work harder to make U.S. military installations more resilient in the face of worsening storms, recurrent flooding, and rising sea levels. The big funding mechanism for the Department of Defense is what's called the National Defense Authorization Act. And the 2021 NDAA expanded funding for existing programs and created others to further address military base resilience, and required DoD to update the 2014 DoD Climate Adaptation Roadmap. And there's several programs among all the services. One of them is called Net Zero, where bases and stations are asked to consider, or at least try to produce more energy than they consume. And that is being done. Nellis Air Force Base is one of them in Las Vegas, has huge solar arrays. And the intent, of course, is to wean them off the local grid. And then eventually, of course, actually provide power back to the local area. And the same thing is happening to my old base, Parris Island in South Carolina. In April of 2018, Vandenberg Air Force Base in California announced the completion of a new solar array system that's going to give them 35% of their base energy. So in April 2020, the Air Force is working on a number of ways to mitigate their CO2 emissions, to include aircraft and vehicles. I did have a big session with the senior general in Great Britain a couple of weeks ago, Lieutenant General Nugi, who was to talk climate change and its impact on the military in Great Britain. And one of their big drives is to electrify all their vehicles. And I just offer this up as an example. When you look at what's happened in Ukraine with Kiev and the Russian convoy, wouldn't it be interesting if they were electrified and didn't have to rely on fossil fuels? Now, some are going to say, how do you repower them? And I would just bet you if they had some solar panels that could repower them, they'd be moving a lot faster than they are today. And I can guarantee you that the Ukrainians are targeting all their fuel supplies. It was General Jim Mattis, the commanding general of the 1st Marine Division in Iraq, who said, could you please get me off this tether of fossil fuels? And, we lost a couple of thousand soldiers, sailors, and airmen and Marines who were guarding fuel convoys that were providing, obviously, the fuel to the vehicles that we needed to survive in combat. And boy, the Russians are feeling this big time today. So I know that there's a big emphasis in DoD looking at all the advantages of renewables and how we can go about using renewables and making them more cost effective. DoD is the #1 single producer of CO2 in this country. And it's obviously the #1 government producer of CO2. And they have some 15 or 16,000 aircraft that are flying just about every day. So you can imagine the carbon footprint that they have with those vehicles. So they've got to reduce their carbon emissions, and they understand it. And of course, if they can wean themselves off of those fossil fuels, there are advantages. And the one tactical advantage or example that I use in regards to weaning yourself off of fossil fuels is the young Lance Corporal who's up on a forward operating base, let's say in the middle of Afghanistan, and he's got all kinds of communications set up, and they're calling in aircraft and calling in fires, but it all takes power. And if they're up at a forward operating base that's remote, they have to bring up batteries and either recharge those batteries, or they're going to bring up diesel fuel. But if you've got a solar panel and rechargeable batteries, you don't have to do any of that. So there is a prime example that you can utilize that. And I can tell you that those types of innovations are occurring across the Department of Defense just routinely. It's happening all the time. All the documents within DoD are being rewritten to include more emphasis on combating climate change and instability worldwide. I didn't get into Asia much at all, but I will offer this one anecdote. You probably know the Ukraine and Russians supply about 30% of the world's wheat. I used to do the example that back in 2010, Russia had huge forest fires, which were fed predominantly by climate change. And what happened was Putin actually embargoed wheat from being exported from Russia in 2010. And as a consequence, it didn't get exported to the Middle East. And the price of bread, and where wheat was a staple and they made bread out of it, skyrocketed. And some say it contributed somewhat to Arab Spring. And I'm just wondering if you're going to see the same thing happen now, because they're not going to be exporting much wheat from Ukraine in the next year or so. And I don't know what's going to happen with Russia, but you will see inflation big time on the price of wheat in the Middle East, and that's going to contribute to instability. So, I often talk about Syria and Aleppo. Syria had the worst drought in its history, 2007 to 2011, and drove most of the farmers into the cities. One of them predominantly was Aleppo, you may be familiar with. And as a consequence of that, Assad was barrel bombing the people that were in Aleppo. And of course, at that time, ISIS was just nascent and beginning. ISIS used those farmers that were unemployed and couldn't provide for their families and recruited them to ISIS. So I can draw a line between climate change, drought, and instability in the Middle East and what it caused there. So these are all problems that aren't going away. And I think the incumbent administration, of course, has made a dramatic change in comparison to what happened under the Trump administration. And I presume you're obviously going to see that continue for the next 2 years. Who knows what's going to happen after that? But I will also tell you that the Department of Defense will continue to plan for instability worldwide. I didn't touch on the Arctic or the Northwest Passage, which it's another one. When you're driving cruise liners through the Northwest Passage, and that's never been done before until the Crystal Serenity did it a couple of years ago, you understand that that's going to open up. And here's another one that the Russians now are building up their military forces on the Northwest Passage. And I don't think it's necessarily a defensive posture. They're going to tax people that go through there and then charge you for emergency relief. That's one of the thoughts that's up there. And of course, we are woefully unprepared for the breaking up of the ice in the Northwest Passage. We have 2 functional icebreakers. Now the new Congress has budgeted for 6, which is a miracle. And we certainly need more. We do not have a deep water port in the Arctic. We need that. I did a session with the Alaska folks in December talking about this specific issue, and they're concerned about it. Another one of their major concerns, of course, is the indigenous villages are literally sinking through the permafrost, and they've had to move them. So they have another real problem with climate change. So Bob, I mean, I've kind of gone all over the place here, but that kind of gives you a picture of where I think climate change is affecting stability worldwide. The islands in the Pacific are all, not all of them, but a vast majority are going underwater. And some of those are missile defense systems for us, by the way, and they're having to move some of those. So that's another problem that the Department of Defense is faced with, places like Wake Island and Midway. So it's just a number of these types of issues that you really have to look at and understand. So I'll cut it at that and see if we can open up to Q&A.
Okay. What about places like Diego Garcia or San Diego? Are those similarly of concern?
Yeah, I mean, you've hit another poster child. You know, Diego Garcia is owned by the British, and we've got a brigade's worth of marine equipment there, and it's a nice waypoint in the Indian Ocean for us to deploy from. It will go underwater. I mean, in my opinion, that's just a fact. So it's a matter, and DoD is aware of this. So long term, you're going to have to move that brigade worth of equipment somewhere else. You're going to have to find another place that's better positioned. I don't know, maybe Guam. You know, Guam has a higher elevation, and we were moving. By the way, we're moving a number of forces from Okinawa to Guam, so they don't have the problem. They're not so low level. San Diego is an interesting problem. You might have read from my bio. I was there stationed there for 7 years, and the recruit depot there is all on landfill right next to the airport. And although they haven't had the flooding problems that, for instance, Parris Island has had, Parris Island is going to have to build a seawall. There's no doubt about it. They're like Charleston. They got parts that are going to go underwater. So they can adapt to that, much like Manhattan has or New Orleans. They can build a seawall and hopefully stop it from in the next couple of feet. But if they get if the Greenland ice sheet melts, you're going to see a sea level rise, and not just in single feet, probably in double-digit feet, and all those coastal bases are really going to have a problem. But San Diego doesn't have quite the problem that some of the others do.
You did cover a little bit about DoD and what it's trying to do to find alternatives to fossil fuels across the DoD, their vehicle fleets, their heating, all the rest of it. Can you expand a little bit on what they're thinking about doing there?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a couple of examples here. You can power your aircraft with renewable fuels, and they've done that, and they've all the aircraft in the inventory, if I remember right, have been powered by renewable fuels. Those made from trees and grasses and that's been done and can be done. So that's the aviation. The amount of CO2 emitted in the atmosphere from aviation is huge. It's huge. But Fred Smith from FedEx has done the same thing, powered all his aircraft with that as well. So there's a way. There are ways to do that. But the other, of course, is the investment into solar and wind. And bases, of course, would do the wind because they're stable. Vehicles, obviously, when you look at Tesla and some of the others, but you have the same problems here. Where do you generate the energy to do the recharging that you have for your electric vehicles? Whether you do that via solar or electric charging is another question. I didn't touch on nuclear energy. Small modular reactors, and it's a really hot button topic given what's happened in Ukraine over the last couple of days. But the Navy's been operating small modular reactors for 60 or 70 years, more than it's 80 years almost, since the Nautilus in 1955, with a flawless safety record, I might add. So we know how to do this. I mean, we know how to make small modular reactors. They don't emit CO2, and I'm familiar with the drawbacks to nuclear power and all that business. But we at the American Security Project have always been huge proponents of nuclear power, and if done right, it's fine, it's safe. And frankly, when you compare the safety record to nuclear power to coal, for instance, the number of people who have died in coal generator plants or coal mines over the years is it's huge number compared to any of the nuclear accidents that they've had. nuke power is an answer. The problem in our country is the nuclear industry has priced itself out of the business trying to build reactors, and they need to get back in the business.
Okay. Is DoD funding any research into alternative energies?
Oh, absolutely. And
James?
yeah, absolutely. And it's not just DoD. There's a number of national labs that are working on this. And
We have two here.
You do. You guys know. You guys know. And yes, they are. And I've been out to Livermore and looked at. We are still proponents of fusion energy, and I know the rap on fusion. And for 30 years, it's been 30 years away. I've been out to Livermore, and they now have looked at what they call the National Ignition Facility there, and they've had a little bit of success over this last couple of months. So on the fusion side of the house, so there's a lot of research in fusion, and of course now industry has lapped onto that, and it's a worldwide thing. There's a big fusion, what they call tokamak, being built in France called the ITER. We are part of a consortium that helps fund that. It's over budget and taken far too long time, but they're working on that. And other labs, the Bell Labs. I've been up to the labs in Chicago and looked at the Argonne lab and looked at how they look at the battery business. In fact, when I was up there, I think 3 or 4 years back, I said something about a Tesla and wanting to get a Tesla. And the guy said, why would you want a Tesla? And for the obvious reasons. And he said, that technology is decades old. He says the battery technology is just going to explode, and you will see batteries. And I think you're starting to see that obviously today in the automotive industry. You'll see batteries that'll power cars that'll go 1,000 miles. That's coming. I mean, that is coming. And DoD is helping with that, of course, and helping pioneer some of that and funding some of it. And of course, they'll be the beneficiary of some of it as well.
Right, right. Do you think this is from one of our members, do you think the Russia-China, Russian-Ukraine conflict and the US-EU reduction in Russian oil and gas will result in a faster transition to alternative energies?
I sure hope so. I mean, I just don't know. Everything is so fluid, what's going on over there now with now the sanctions put on by the United States on Russian oil. And it's very problematic for Germany and Great Britain with the percentage that they import from Russia. And it's going to cause them huge pain. Now they have, as I understand it, they haven't sanctioned it yet. You would think that people would look at that and go, wow, shouldn't we have alternatives to fossil fuels here? We wouldn't be so dependent on any kind of fossil fuel, let alone coming from Russia. And as we all know, Germany shut down all its nuke power plants. And in contrast to that, France is actually going to build more. So you would kind of think that Germany would rethink this a little bit. But when I was over there, just after, or right now, they say that just before I came to see you guys the last time, I was in Berlin, and they were worried stiff about what's going to happen under the Trump administration. And of course, they had shut down all their nuke power plants already. So I would think that this would cause everybody to think twice about this, and you'd have a much bigger push for all kinds of renewables, and understand that, hey, we can get off that tether of fossil fuels, as Jim Mattis said.
Okay. You mentioned earlier that in your presentation that you had recently talked to one of the leaders of the department, the equivalent of the Department of Defense in Great Britain. I've seen a reasonable amount of bits and pieces about the work in the British Isles trying to use the tidal flow and that sort of stuff to generate electricity. Did you happen to speak to that at all?
I did not speak to that with him, but I'm very familiar with it. I had a friend who invested in some of it in the Bay of Fundy up in Maine, and there are several companies that are investing in that technology in various ways to do it. Obviously, the power of the ocean coming in would turn a rotor, which would generate the electricity, and then you put it via cable ashore. And I know a company that has done that in Portland, Maine. It was actually feeding power to the local Coast Guard station up there. So that is one way to do it. I think the problem is, one, getting enough power out of it, and second, the cost.
Yeah. But it's, as we all know, these technologies cost a lot, but if they can be, if you can get that ROI, that right return on investment, it works out fairly well.
Oh, absolutely.
We have another question from another member. First of all, thanking you for your making the presentation. He wants to talk about Africa a bit. Africa. We see that climate change is forcing hundreds of thousands of African farmers and village dwellers off their land as climate refugees. Is our country developing or exploring any practical strategies to mitigate this challenge and potential threat? And of course, you also mentioned the same thing is occurring in Latin America.
Yes and yes, to answer your question, although I don't think it's number one priority with the incumbent administration, but they understand what's going on. The Sahel is a huge problem. Now, if you're familiar with the Sahel in sub-Saharan Africa, it has now become the hotbed for terrorism in Africa. I mean, it is the hotbed. There's a resurgence of ISIS there. And what's happening is, of course, families are moving. There's instability. There's inability to subsist and pay your family to get them to eat. And these terrorist organizations, just as they did in Syria and then did in Mali, are taking advantage of this and are employing people who are unemployed to be terrorists and take down governments. And Burkina Faso is just but one example of this. So there is migration. There is going to be huge migration problem. Lake Chad was another one. Chad had lost about 90% of its water, and as a consequence, the fish obviously left, and the farmers had to move, and that caused in Niger, that caused big problems as well. In terms of what we are doing specifically, I'm not aware of us doing any specific, the United States specific program to mitigate the migration problem in Africa right now. But nonetheless, it's going to be one that's going to increase.
Okay. Another Dennis McCants asked, is the DoD investigating ways of storing electricity? You have talked about the solar farms and the wind farms that they're putting up, but the issue is always, what do we do at night?
Yeah, I mean, battery tech, and I touched on that with a little bit with the Argonne Labs. The battery technology that's the big problem. You know, once the sun goes down, you're not generating any electricity. Hopefully, you've stored enough to get through the darkness and then keep it going. And so I can guarantee you, I know all the labs are working on improved battery technology and trying to get that and there's going to be some marked increases in that over the years. I mean, you will see this happening. I mean, you're seeing it happening now in the commercial sector, and you're going to see it happen in the commercial cars that are going to, as you know, huge movement here to go to EVs across all segments. Look at Ford's truck that they're coming out with, the F-150 Lightning. And Tesla's going to come out with one that's going to go 1,000 miles on a single charge. So you will see some dramatic improvements in battery technology.
Okay. Jane Summerson asked, your take on the Department of Energy role in all the research, and have they been involved in this work with DoD?
Yeah. DOE's part in it is huge. You know, the Department of Energy, I talked a little bit about the nuke side of the house and fusion, which they will obviously oversee to some extent. And the batteries in the labs, they're involved in that as well. You know, the Nuclear Regulatory Agency, all those, yes, DOE plays an important part of this. And part of the problem we've had over the last 4 years, a lot of that funding was taken away or reshuffled by the Trump administration. You're seeing that obviously put back in. So they reinvigorate these research programs to increase the technology and hopefully help us in those areas.
Art Bova was wondering about missing minerals from Ukraine. You talked about the potential impact of losing the wheat crop. Are there any other critical basic minerals that we're used to get from Ukraine that we won't be able to get anymore, or will,
you know, there
at least
are,
be suspended?
and I'm telling you what I just read recently. There, and I don't have them off the tip of my tongue, but I know they are exporters of a number of minerals, and obviously that's all going to stop, and will ricochet across Europe in particular, but worldwide. But right now I don't know the exact which ones are going to stop.
Okay. Yeah, and I'm sure also we're going to have the same issues with Russia as people try to shut down their stuff.
Yeah, big time.
Yeah. Okay, I think that looks like that's our questions. You did such a good job on the presentation. You answered too many questions already.
Well, my regret is I didn't come out there to see you guys in person.
Oh, listen, believe me, we would have enjoyed having you again. I recall well your first visit and how much information you brought to us for that. So thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it greatly. I would remind all of our members that we have a meeting on April the 5th with Rachel Rizzo from the Atlantic Council on the new German leadership, and on April the 7th with Mr. Talablu from the Foundation on the Defense of Democracies, and he'll be talking about Iran and the potential with the nuclear deal there. So, General Cheney, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate you taking time out of your evening to speak to us, and appreciate your insights.
Well, I appreciate you inviting me, and go on our website, americansecurityproject.org. And I said we have an event tomorrow afternoon at 2:00 East Coast time, which would be noon, I think, your time, that
Right.
that you'd be very interested in. So we're staying on top of the Ukraine issue. But thanks again, Bob.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Good evening.